He had given the order months ago, in a place that smelled of dust, sunburned metal, and the quiet exhaustion of men who had seen too much, and no one believed a dog would remember it. On a cold night in western Montana, Captain Daniel Hayes sat alone in a small wooden house at the edge of a pine valley where the mountains rolled dark against the winter sky, the kind of place where the wind carried the scent of snow and distant wood smoke through the cracks of old windows. Daniel was 37 years old, a former U.S. Marine who now walked with a careful limp and a patience that came only after life forced a man to slow down. His house was simple, a weathered structure with a narrow porch and a single yellow bulb glowing above the door, casting a soft circle of light onto the frost-silvered steps. Inside, the room smelled faintly of coffee and cedar. A pair of worn combat boots rested beside the couch. A Marine Corps flag hung neatly on the wall, and beside the kitchen counter, as it had been every evening for nearly a year, sat a stainless steel dog bowl that had never once been moved. Daniel kept it there out of habit, though most people would have called it foolish hope. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with a low whisper that sounded almost like distant waves. The clock on the wall read a little past midnight. Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing the scar that ran along his forearm, a silent reminder of a battlefield half a world away. Nights were the hardest. During the day, he could keep busy repairing fences, fixing engines for neighbors, or hiking the quiet trails that stretched for miles across the valley. But when the world grew quiet, memories returned. Not loud, not dramatic, just small fragments that drifted back like snowflakes. Boots on gravel, a helicopter somewhere above the desert horizon, and the steady presence of a German shepherd who had once walked beside him like a shadow that never left. Ranger had been more than a military dog. Ranger had been his partner, his early warning system, and sometimes the only living creature who seemed to understand the silence that soldiers carried home from war. Daniel reached for his mug and took a slow sip of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside, the valley was empty. No passing cars, no distant headlights, just wind, trees, and the faint creak of the porch boards settling in the cold. Then it came, a sound so soft it almost blended with the wind. One single tap against the wooden door. Daniel froze. At first he thought it was the porch shifting under the weight of frost. But then it came again. Not loud, not urgent, just the faintest scratch, like tired paws brushing old wood after a very long journey. Daniel stood slowly, the chair legs scraping softly across the floor. He felt something strange rise in his chest, a feeling he had not allowed himself to believe in for months. The porch light flickered through the thin curtain beside the door, and beyond it, just barely visible through the frosted glass, was the outline of a shape standing perfectly still in the winter night. Daniel Hayes stood motionless in the dim light of the living room, staring at the door as the faint scratching came once more, softer now, almost hesitant, as though whatever waited outside had already traveled farther than any creature should and was no longer certain it had the strength to ask again. The wind drifted along the porch and pushed a thin veil of snow across the wooden boards, whispering through the pine trees that surrounded the narrow valley. For a long moment Daniel did not move. His heart beat slowly but heavily, each breath filling his chest with the cold scent that seeped through the seams of the old door. The outline beyond the frosted glass remained still, not pacing, not barking, just waiting. Daniel reached forward and rested his hand against the doorframe. The wood felt cool beneath his palm. Somewhere deep in his memory a voice stirred, quiet but unmistakable, the echo of another night far from this mountain valley. A night where the air had smelled of sand and diesel fuel instead of pine and snow. He had heard paws before in places where no animal should have been. Heard that steady presence beside him during long patrols across silent desert roads that stretched mile after mile under a sky filled with unfamiliar stars. Ranger had always walked slightly ahead, ears alert, amber eyes scanning the darkness with a calm confidence that no training manual could truly explain. Daniel swallowed and slowly turned the brass handle. The latch clicked softly. Cold air slipped into the room the moment the door opened, carrying with it the scent of frost and distant forest. The porch light glowed down onto the narrow steps where a shape stood at the edge of the circle of light. At first Daniel only saw fur darkened by travel and a body thinner than any healthy shepherd should ever be. Snow dusted the animal's back like pale ash. Its legs trembled slightly, not from fear but from exhaustion that seemed to reach all the way into its bones. The dog did not bark. It did not rush forward. It simply looked up at him. Those eyes stopped the world. Amber, steady, and filled with the same quiet intelligence Daniel remembered from a lifetime that now felt impossibly distant. For a second, neither of them moved. The wind shifted across the valley, stirring the pine branches above the house, and the dog took one careful step forward onto the porch boards. Daniel noticed the collar then. Old leather, cracked from weather and time, resting loosely around the shepherd's neck. Hanging from it was a small metal tag that glinted faintly under the porch light. The dog lowered its head slightly, breathing slow and shallow, as though every mile of its journey had finally come to rest on this one wooden doorstep. Daniel felt his throat tighten in a way that surprised him. He had prepared himself for many things since returning home from the war. Long winters, quiet nights, memories that refused to fade. But he had never truly prepared for this moment. The shepherd lifted its head again, studying his face with patient recognition, and Daniel understood something without a single sound being spoken. The order had been simple. Go home. Daniel did not realize he had stopped breathing until the cold air stung his lungs. The German shepherd remained on the porch, silent and steady, as if it had been standing there long before the night itself arrived. Snow gathered lightly along the dog's back and shoulders, melting slowly against fur worn thin by travel. For a moment the world seemed smaller than it should have been, reduced to the quiet porch, the weak glow of the yellow light above the door, and the distance of two living souls who once knew each other better than words could. Explain. Daniel stepped forward slowly, careful with the leg that never quite moved the way it used to. The old wooden boards creaked under his weight. The dog did not retreat. It simply watched him with calm patience, its chest rising and falling in slow, tired breaths. Up close the signs of the journey became clearer. The shepherd's coat carried dust beneath the snow, a strange mix of road and wilderness. The edges of the leather collar were cracked and faded by sun and rain, as though the seasons themselves had passed over it again and again. Daniel knelt carefully, one hand resting against the porch rail for balance. His eyes fell on the small metal tag hanging from the collar. The tag swung gently in the winter wind and caught the light. For a long second he could not bring himself to touch it, because once he did, the truth would no longer belong to memory or hope. It would belong to the present. His fingers finally closed around the metal. The tag was colder than ice. He turned it slightly until the engraving faced the porch light. The letters were scratched but still clear. Ranger. Beneath the name was a second line, the one issued years ago at the training unit in Virginia. United States Marine Corps K-9 unit. Daniel felt something shift quietly inside his chest. Not shock, not disbelief. Something deeper and heavier than either of those things. Recognition. The shepherd lowered its head and took one slow step forward until its nose hovered inches from Daniel's shoulder. The movement was careful, almost respectful, as though the dog remembered the rhythm of approaching a partner who had once depended on that same quiet awareness during long patrols. Daniel exhaled slowly. He could hear the wind crossing the valley behind him, rustling through the tall pines that lined the ridge 200 yards from the house. The mountains beyond were hidden beneath drifting clouds, but the cold carried the promise of fresh snow before morning. Ranger's ears twitched slightly as the breeze shifted. Even after everything, the instinct to listen had not faded. Daniel finally raised his hand and placed it gently against the side of the shepherd's neck. The fur was rough and cool beneath his fingers, yet unmistakably familiar. The dog leaned into the touch without hesitation. That small movement unlocked a door in Daniel's mind that had remained closed for nearly a year. Suddenly he could see another place entirely. Not snow and pine trees, but endless desert stretching beneath a pale sky. A convoy road cutting through miles of dust and heat. Ranger walking ahead with the same steady focus, nose to the wind, ears forward. The memory arrived quietly but clearly, like the echo of footsteps returning down a long hallway. Daniel whispered the name without realizing it. Ranger. The name lingered in the cold air between them, quiet and almost fragile, as though speaking it too loudly might break the strange moment that had settled over the porch. Ranger lifted his head slightly when he heard it, the amber eyes focusing with a spark of recognition that traveled deeper than simple training. Daniel had seen that look many times before in places far from this quiet valley. It was the look Ranger gave whenever a mission began, the silent signal that said he understood his partner without the need for another command. Daniel remained kneeling on the porch while the winter wind moved gently around them, carrying the distant scent of snow from the mountains rising 2,000 feet above the valley floor. The dog stepped closer until the space between them disappeared entirely. Ranger pressed the side of his face against Daniel's shoulder with slow, careful certainty, as if confirming that the man before him was not another memory, but the same human he had followed across deserts and roads that seemed endless. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Beneath his hand, he could feel the steady rhythm of the shepherd's breathing, slower now that the journey had finally ended. That small, living warmth was enough to bring the past back with surprising clarity. The desert returned first. A road that stretched across a wide plain where heat shimmered in the distance like waves on water. Daniel had walked that road beside a convoy during the long afternoons when the sun hung overhead and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. Ranger had always moved ahead of the vehicles, nose lifted slightly into the wind, listening to a world invisible to everyone else. Sometimes the dog would pause, ears forward, tail still, and Daniel would stop without asking why. Trust had grown there in the quiet space between instinct and command. Ranger would glance back once, waiting for the nod that meant continue. That silent language had carried them through countless miles together. Daniel opened his eyes again and studied the shepherd more closely. The years had changed him, but not the things that mattered. The scar along the dog's left ear was still there, the faint mark from a training exercise long before their first deployment. The shape of the eyes was the same. The calm intelligence. The unspoken patience that had always made Ranger different from every other working dog Daniel had met. The shepherd lowered himself slowly onto the porch boards, exhaustion finally winning the quiet battle that had kept him standing. Snow drifted lightly across the valley road beyond the yard, and the night seemed to hold its breath around the small house at the edge of the forest. Daniel rose carefully and opened the door wider. Warm air from inside the house spilled out across the porch. Ranger lifted his head at the familiar scent of wood and coffee. For a moment he hesitated, as though remembering the last command given so many months before in a place far from snow and pine trees. Then Daniel stepped aside and spoke softly, the words simple but full of meaning. "Come inside, partner." Warm air wrapped around Ranger the moment he crossed the doorway, carrying the familiar scent of cedarwood, coffee, and the quiet stillness of a home that had waited far longer than anyone expected. The shepherd stepped carefully across the wooden floor, his movements slow but steady, as if each step required him to confirm that the long road was truly over. Snow melted from his coat and left small dark patches on the boards behind him. Daniel closed the door against the wind and stood for a moment watching the dog breathe in the room around him. The house was simple, only 2 rooms and a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom in the back, but it carried the kind of quiet comfort that soldiers often dream about during long deployments. A wood stove crackled softly near the far wall, filling the room with a low, steady warmth. Ranger lifted his head toward the sound, and then toward the scent drifting from the kitchen counter. His eyes settled there. The stainless steel bowl still sat exactly where Daniel had left it every evening for nearly a year. The metal reflected the stove light in a faint silver glow. Daniel noticed the direction of the shepherd's gaze and felt a quiet breath leave his chest. He walked slowly toward the counter, the familiar limp in his step echoing softly through the room. For months that bowl had been nothing more than a promise he refused to break, a small act of faith that no one else needed to understand. Tonight, it was no longer empty hope. Daniel reached for a bag of dry dog food stored beneath the counter and filled the bowl with steady hands. The sound of the kibble falling against the metal echoed gently through the quiet room. Ranger remained where he was, watching with patient attention, as though the meaning of the moment mattered more than the meal itself. When Daniel set the bowl down, the shepherd approached slowly and lowered his head to eat. The movements were careful but certain, the kind of calm hunger that comes after a journey measured not in miles alone, but in endurance. Daniel leaned back against the counter and watched him. Outside, the storm had begun to gather across the valley. Snow drifted against the windows and softened the outlines of the pine trees that surrounded the small house. Somewhere in the distance, the wind rolled down from the mountains and carried the deep quiet of winter across the open land. Ranger finished the food and lifted his head, breathing slowly. For the first time since arriving, the tension in his body seemed to fade. He walked a few steps toward the center of the room and lowered himself onto the rug beside the wood stove. The warmth settled into his tired frame almost immediately. His ears twitched once at the sound of the fire and then relaxed. Daniel crossed the room and sat down in the old chair near the stove. For a long while neither of them spoke or moved. The silence was not empty. It was the kind of silence that only forms between companions who have already said everything that matters through years of shared roads and quiet understanding. Ranger's eyes slowly closed as sleep finally found him. Daniel studied the worn collar resting against the shepherd's neck and felt the weight of a question settle into his mind. 3,000 miles was a distance most travelers would struggle to cross even with maps and roads, and vehicles to guide them. Yet somehow Ranger had followed a command given in another world and arrived here at this door in the middle of a Montana winter. Daniel looked toward the dark window where snow continued to fall across the valley and spoke softly into the quiet room as if the night itself might hold the answer. "How did you find your way home, Ranger?" The fire in the wood stove burned steadily through the night, filling the small house with a quiet warmth that pushed back the deep Montana cold pressing against the walls outside. Snow continued to fall across the valley, covering the narrow dirt road and the frozen grass in a soft white blanket that glowed faintly under the distant moonlight. Inside the house, Ranger slept beside the stove, his body curled tightly against the rug as though the warmth itself had become something precious after so many months of wind and open sky. His breathing was slow and even now, but every so often his ears twitched gently, reacting to sounds that existed only in memory. Daniel Hayes remained awake in the chair across the room. The clock above the kitchen doorway ticked quietly, each second slipping past while he watched the shepherd rest. He had spent nearly a year believing Ranger was gone. After the deployment ended and he returned home to Montana, the silence left by the dog had been heavier than any injury he carried from the war. Ranger had been part of every mission, every patrol, every quiet mile of desert road where trust mattered more than words. The two of them had moved like a single unit shaped by routine and instinct. Daniel leaned forward slightly and rested his forearms on his knees, studying the worn collar around the shepherd's neck. The leather was faded by sun and weather, but the metal tag still reflected the firelight with a small, steady glint. Somewhere beyond the mountains, thousands of miles away, lay the last place Daniel had seen Ranger before that final order had left his lips. The memory returned slowly now, carried on the quiet rhythm of the stove and the falling snow outside. It had been late afternoon in the desert, the sun lowering toward a dusty horizon that stretched across miles of empty land. Their unit had been moving along a long supply road where the heat shimmered above the sand, and every sound traveled farther than it should have. Ranger had been walking ahead as always, focused and alert, the way he had been trained since the day Daniel first met him at the K-9 training facility years earlier. Daniel could still remember the instructor placing the leash in his hand and saying that some dogs followed commands while others followed people. Ranger had done both. That day on the desert road had begun like countless others, quiet and routine, until the moment the world shifted. Daniel remembered the taste of dust in the air and the distant rumble of engines behind him. He remembered calling Ranger's name and seeing the shepherd turn his head, waiting for the next instruction. Then came the moment when instinct replaced routine and decisions had to be made quickly. Daniel had looked down at the dog beside him, the same steady eyes watching him without fear or confusion. The command he gave had been simple, spoken almost like a promise carried on the wind. Go home. Ranger had hesitated for only a heartbeat before turning and running across the open desert. Daniel had believed the shepherd would return to the nearest base and be cared for by the handlers who understood dogs like him. He had never imagined that the meaning of home might travel farther than maps or orders could explain. Across the room, Ranger stirred slightly in his sleep and lifted his head for a brief moment. His eyes opened just enough to find Daniel sitting in the chair beside the stove. The shepherd watched him quietly for a second, then lowered his head again, and returned to sleep as if reassured that the journey truly had ended. Morning arrived quietly over the valley, the pale light of winter spreading slowly across the snow-covered hills that stretched for miles beyond Daniel Hayes's small house. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving the world outside wrapped in a clean silence that only fresh snow could create. Pine branches sagged under the white weight, and the narrow dirt road leading past the house had vanished beneath nearly 8 inches of powder. Inside the cabin, the fire in the wood stove had burned low but steady through the night. Ranger still slept beside it, stretched across the rug where warmth gathered along the wooden floorboards. The long journey had left its mark. Even in sleep, his body seemed careful, conserving strength the way animals do after traveling farther than instinct alone should allow. Daniel woke slowly in the chair where he had finally drifted off sometime before sunrise. His neck ached slightly from the awkward position, but he barely noticed. The first thing he saw was the shepherd still resting near the stove. For a moment, he simply watched the quiet rise and fall of the dog's breathing. In the morning light, Ranger looked smaller than Daniel remembered from the days of deployment. Months on the road had thinned his frame, yet the same calm focus remained in the lines of his face. Daniel stood carefully and stepped closer. Ranger's ears lifted before his eyes opened, the old training still alive beneath sleep. When he saw Daniel standing there, the shepherd raised his head and thumped his tail once against the rug, a simple greeting that carried more meaning than excitement ever could. Daniel crouched beside him and ran his hand gently along the dog's back. The fur was still rough from travel, but warmer now, carrying the quiet comfort of a place where the journey had ended. Outside the window, the sun climbed slowly above the eastern ridge, nearly 2,000 feet above the valley floor, sending long beams of light across the snow-covered fields. Daniel glanced toward the front door, where the world waited beyond the porch. Somewhere out there lay the miles Ranger had crossed to arrive here. Highways, forests, small towns where strangers might have glimpsed a lone shepherd moving steadily along the edge of the road. Daniel could not yet imagine the full story, but the evidence stood before him, breathing quietly beside the stove. Ranger pushed himself slowly to his feet and walked toward the door, stopping just short of it, as if asking permission in the silent language he and Daniel had shared for years. Daniel opened the door, and cold air rolled gently into the house, carrying the crisp scent of pine and winter sunlight. Ranger stepped onto the porch and paused there, looking out across the valley. The land stretched wide and still beneath the morning sky. Snow covered the open fields, and the dark forest beyond looked untouched by anything except wind and time. Ranger stood there quietly, studying the horizon, as if confirming something deep inside his memory. Then he turned his head and looked back at Daniel. In that single glance, Daniel understood what the shepherd had known all along. This place was not just another stop along the road. This was the destination the command had meant from the beginning. Home. The morning remained clear and still across the Montana Valley as Ranger stepped slowly down from the porch and placed his paws into the fresh snow. The surface was soft and untouched, nearly 8 inches deep, and the sound it made beneath his weight was quiet and crisp. Daniel Hayes stood in the doorway watching him, one hand resting against the frame while the cold winter air moved gently through the open door behind him. Ranger walked only a few yards from the house before stopping. His nose lifted toward the breeze, testing the air the way he had done countless times before on distant patrol roads thousands of miles away. The instinct had not faded. Even here, in a peaceful valley far removed from deserts and convoys, the shepherd listened carefully to the world around him. The pine forest that bordered the eastern edge of the valley stretched nearly half a mile from the house, rising gradually toward the foothills that eventually climbed into the Rocky Mountains. Sunlight now spilled across the white fields, turning the snow into a wide, quiet mirror that reflected the pale winter sky. Ranger turned in a slow circle, studying the land with calm attention. His paws left a trail of clear prints across the yard, each one marking the simple truth that he had arrived exactly where he meant to be. Daniel stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind him. The boards creaked softly beneath his weight as he leaned on the railing and watched the shepherd explore the small clearing around the cabin. Ranger moved toward the edge of the yard where the snow met the darker line of pine trees. There he paused again, looking out across the long valley road that curved past the property and disappeared between the hills nearly a quarter-mile away. Daniel followed the direction of his gaze. That road eventually joined a state highway 30 miles to the west, a narrow stretch of pavement that carried occasional trucks through the mountains. It was the only path in or out of this quiet corner of Montana. Daniel tried to imagine the miles that lay beyond it. Cities, farms, endless highways crossing the country from coast to coast. Somewhere along those roads Ranger had traveled alone, guided by something deeper than training manuals or commands shouted across a training field. Ranger lowered his nose to the snow and moved slowly along the edge of the yard, reading the scents carried by the wind overnight. A deer had crossed there not long before sunrise. A rabbit had passed through the brush near the fence line. The shepherd absorbed each detail quietly, as if confirming that this land now belonged to the two of them. After a few minutes, he turned back toward the house. His walk was still careful, conserving strength that had not yet fully returned after the long journey. When he reached the porch, he looked up at Daniel with the same steady calm that had defined him since the first day they met. Daniel stepped down from the porch and met him halfway across the yard. The cold air stung his lungs, but he barely noticed. Ranger stood before him in the winter sunlight, snow clinging to the edges of his paws. For a long moment, neither moved. The valley stretched wide and silent around them, while the mountains stood watch in the distance. Daniel finally placed a hand on the shepherd's neck and looked out across the land that had become their quiet refuge. The road that had brought Ranger here disappeared somewhere far beyond the horizon, but the path ahead now led only through this valley, this home, and the quiet life waiting to be rebuilt one peaceful day at a time. The valley settled into a deep winter quiet as the morning continued to unfold beneath a pale blue sky. Ranger remained beside Daniel Hayes in the yard, the sunlight reflecting off the snow around them and casting long shadows toward the pine forest that bordered the property nearly 300 yards away. The cold air carried the clean scent of mountain winter, sharp and bright in a way that made every breath feel new. Ranger stood calmly with his head lifted toward the wind, listening. Even here, in a place far removed from the distant deserts and roads of his long journey, the instincts that had guided him across so many miles remained strong. Daniel watched the shepherd carefully, noticing the way Ranger studied the valley as though memorizing it piece by piece. The open field stretched nearly half a mile before rising into gentle hills where the tree line thickened and the mountains began their steady climb toward the western horizon. Somewhere beyond those mountains lay the highways and towns that Ranger must have crossed to reach this quiet place. Daniel found himself imagining the unseen chapters of that journey. Perhaps a truck driver had once noticed the determined shepherd trotting along the shoulder of a highway. Perhaps a family at a roadside diner had left out a bowl of water for a tired traveler with amber eyes and a worn collar. Ranger had always been the kind of dog that drew quiet kindness from strangers without asking for it. The shepherd began to walk slowly across the yard again, his paws pressing fresh tracks into the untouched snow. Each step was measured and calm, no longer driven by the urgency that must have carried him across 3,000 miles. Now his movements held a different purpose. He was learning this place. Ranger paused near the old wooden fence that marked the edge of Daniel's property. Beyond it, the land sloped gently downward toward a frozen creek that wound through the valley floor nearly 100 yards away. The water beneath the ice moved slowly, creating a faint whisper that drifted upward through the cold air. Ranger lowered his nose to the snow and breathed in the quiet story of the land. The scent of deer lingered faintly along the fence line. A pair of small birds had hopped through the branches earlier that morning, leaving delicate tracks across the white surface. The shepherd absorbed each detail with the calm focus that had once kept Daniel safe on long patrols. Daniel stepped closer and leaned against the fence, his eyes following Ranger as the dog lifted his head again and looked back toward the cabin. The small house stood quietly against the backdrop of towering pines, smoke rising gently from the chimney into the still winter sky. It was not a grand place, but it was steady and warm, the kind of home built not for show but for living. Ranger walked back toward Daniel and stopped beside him, his shoulder brushing lightly against the man's leg. Daniel rested his hand once more against the shepherd's neck, feeling the quiet strength that had carried Ranger across half a continent. Neither of them spoke. They simply stood there together while the morning sun climbed higher above the mountains, and the long road that had brought them back to each other faded quietly into memory. The sun continued its slow climb across the Montana sky, casting a brighter light over the valley and softening the sharp blue shadows that stretched across the snow. Daniel Hayes and Ranger remained by the old fence for a while longer, both of them quiet, both of them listening to the stillness that filled the wide, open land. The world felt different now, though nothing in the valley had truly changed. The same mountain stood in the distance, rising nearly 3,000 feet above the fields. The same frozen creek wound through the low ground beyond the fence. Yet the house behind them no longer felt empty. Ranger shifted his weight and began walking slowly along the fence line, his paws moving more confidently now that warmth and rest had begun to restore his strength. Daniel followed at a measured pace, the familiar stiffness in his leg reminding him that some journeys left marks that never fully disappeared. Ranger reached the corner of the fence where an old gate opened toward a narrow trail leading down to the creek. The path was nearly buried beneath fresh snow, but the shepherd paused there with interest, studying the slope that descended through scattered pine saplings toward the frozen water about 100 yards away. Daniel leaned against the fence post and watched him with a quiet smile. In the years before the deployment, Ranger had often followed him along that same trail during long walks through the valley. They would spend hours down by the creek, where the water ran clear in summer and the tall grass moved like waves beneath the wind. Daniel wondered if some small memory of that place still lived inside the shepherd. Ranger stepped through the gate carefully and began moving down the slope. His paws sank softly into the snow, leaving a trail that curved toward the trees. Daniel hesitated only a moment before following. The trail was steeper than he remembered, but the cold air filled his lungs with a steady clarity that pushed away the stiffness in his leg. Ranger reached the edge of the creek and stopped. The water beneath. The thin ice flowed slowly, creating a faint, steady sound that echoed gently along the valley floor. Ranger lowered his head and sniffed along the frozen bank, then lifted his gaze across the open stretch of land beyond the water. The valley seemed endless from this point, a quiet world untouched by the noise and urgency of distant highways. Daniel stepped beside him and rested his hand once again on the shepherd's neck. Ranger did not move away. Instead, he leaned slightly into the touch, the way he had done countless times during long patrols when reassurance traveled silently between them. For a moment, Daniel looked back up the hill toward the cabin. Smoke still drifted from the chimney, rising slowly into the winter sky like a signal that warmth waited there. Ranger followed his gaze and then looked up at him again, the calm certainty in his eyes unchanged by the long miles behind them. Daniel nodded once, as though answering a question that had been waiting for months. Together they turned back toward the trail leading home, their footsteps moving side by side through the fresh snow while the quiet valley welcomed them into a new beginning. Daniel Hayes and Ranger climbed the narrow trail back toward the cabin at an easy pace, their footsteps pressing a new path into the untouched snow that blanketed the hillside. The sun had risen higher now, bright enough to send a soft warmth across the valley, even though the air remained cold enough to sting the lungs with every breath. Ranger moved beside Daniel with quiet patience, no longer driven by the relentless determination that had carried him across thousands of miles. His stride had slowed to match the steady rhythm of Daniel's step, the same silent adjustment he had made countless times during the years they worked together. Halfway up the slope, Ranger paused and turned his head toward the forest. His ears lifted slightly as the wind shifted between the tall pines. Daniel stopped as well, watching the shepherd with the calm trust that had always defined their partnership. Ranger listened for a moment, then relaxed and continued walking. The instinct to observe every sound had not faded, but the urgency was gone now. This valley was quiet, the kind of place where danger was measured only in winter storms and long nights rather than distant conflicts and uncertain roads. When they reached the yard again, the cabin stood waiting just as it had that morning, its windows glowing faintly in the sunlight and a thin ribbon of smoke still drifting from the chimney. Ranger crossed the yard and climbed the porch steps with a slow confidence that seemed to deepen with each passing minute. Daniel followed and rested his hand against the door before opening it again. Warm air greeted them as they stepped inside. The wood stove had settled into a steady burn, filling the room with a soft orange glow that spread across the walls and floorboards. Ranger walked to the center of the room and turned once before settling down again beside the stove, the warmth easing the stiffness that lingered in his body. Daniel removed his coat and hung it beside the door. For the first time in many months, the small house no longer felt like a place waiting for something that might never arrive. It felt complete. Daniel walked to the kitchen counter and poured fresh water into the stainless steel bowl beside the stove. Ranger lifted his head briefly, watching him with quiet attention before lowering his muzzle to drink. Outside, the wind had begun to move gently through the valley again, stirring the snow along the edges of the road and brushing the pine branches with a low whisper that carried across the fields. Daniel stepped to the window and looked out across the wide white landscape. Somewhere far beyond those hills lay the long path Ranger had followed to reach this place. The journey itself might never be fully understood, but the meaning of it stood clear beside the fire behind him. Daniel glanced over his shoulder and saw Ranger resting peacefully with his head on his paws, eyes half closed in the steady warmth of the room. For the first time since returning home, Daniel felt the quiet certainty that some bonds do not fade with distance or time. They simply wait for the moment when two paths finally lead back to the same door. The day moved quietly toward afternoon as the warmth of the cabin settled deeper into the small wooden rooms. Outside, the sky remained clear, the winter sun gliding slowly across the valley while long shadows stretched over the snow-covered fields. Inside the house, Ranger rested beside the wood stove, his body finally relaxed in a way that had not been possible during the long miles of travel. The steady crackle of the fire created a soft rhythm that filled the silence between the walls. Daniel Hayes sat at the kitchen table with a mug of fresh coffee warming his hands, his eyes drifting now and then toward the shepherd resting across the room. Every so often, Ranger lifted his head to look at him, as though confirming that the man he had followed across continents was still there. Each time Daniel met his gaze, the same quiet understanding passed between them, the same silent language they had carried through deserts, roads, and now back to this quiet valley. After a while, Daniel rose from the chair and stepped to the small shelf near the hallway. There, resting carefully in a wooden frame, was a photograph taken several years earlier at the training grounds in Virginia. In the picture, a younger Daniel stood in uniform beside a strong young German shepherd whose ears were sharp and alert. Ranger had been barely 2 years old then, full of energy and curiosity. Daniel lifted the frame and studied the image for a moment before setting it gently on the table. Ranger noticed the movement and slowly pushed himself to his feet. The warmth of the stove had already begun restoring strength to his tired body. He walked across the floor and stopped beside the table, his nose lifting toward the photograph. Daniel knelt beside him and placed a hand along the shepherd's neck, his fingers resting against the familiar collar that had endured months of weather and distance. For a moment, the room held only the quiet sound of the fire and the soft wind brushing against the cabin walls outside. Daniel looked once more at the photograph and then at the living companion standing beside him. The distance between those two moments in time felt impossible to measure. Yet somehow Ranger had bridged it step by step across the land. Daniel returned the photograph to the shelf and walked toward the window. The afternoon light had begun to soften, spreading a golden glow across the snow fields beyond the yard. The frozen creek shimmered faintly in the distance, while the pine trees stood dark and steady against the horizon. Ranger followed and sat beside him, both of them looking out across the valley together. The road that curved past the property remained quiet beneath its blanket of snow. Somewhere far beyond those hills, the world continued to rush forward with noise and movement, but here time moved differently. Daniel rested his hand gently on Ranger's back and felt the calm strength that had carried the shepherd across 3,000 miles simply to obey one quiet command. In the stillness of the cabin, Daniel understood that the journey had not only brought Ranger home. It had also brought something back to him that he thought the war had taken forever: peace. Evening arrived gently over the valley as the winter sun lowered behind the distant ridgeline, leaving the sky painted in long bands of pale gold and quiet blue. The snow across the fields reflected that fading light, turning the entire valley into a calm mirror that stretched nearly a mile from the cabin to the dark forest beyond. Inside the house, the wood stove glowed softly, its warmth filling the room with a steady comfort that seemed to settle deeper with every passing hour. Ranger remained near the window beside Daniel Hayes, both of them watching the final light of the day drift slowly across the frozen land. The valley had grown even quieter as dusk approached. The wind had softened, and the distant mountains stood like silent guardians above the horizon. Ranger rested his head against Daniel's leg, his breathing slow and peaceful now that the long road behind him had finally ended. Daniel placed a hand gently on the shepherd's back and let it remain there, feeling the calm strength that had carried this loyal companion across 3,000 miles of highways, fields, towns, and wilderness. The journey itself would always remain partly a mystery. Perhaps strangers had offered small kindness along the way. Perhaps instinct and memory had guided each step across the vast country between the desert and this quiet valley in Montana. But the reason for the journey was never truly complicated. Ranger had simply followed the meaning of one command spoken by the only partner he trusted. Outside, the last light faded from the snow and the first evening stars appeared above the mountains. The valley slowly returned to darkness, but the cabin window continued to glow with the warm light of the fire inside. Daniel looked down at Ranger and saw the shepherd's eyes open briefly, calm and certain, the same way they had always looked during long patrols when trust mattered more than anything else. Daniel smiled quietly and whispered the words that had carried them both across time and distance. "Welcome home, Ranger." The shepherd's tail moved gently once against the floor before he settled again beside the fire, the long journey finally complete. And in that quiet house at the edge of the valley, beneath a sky filled with winter stars, two old partners began a new chapter of life together, one peaceful day at a time.